Hello students, today's video lecture is on the divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We'll be concentrating on the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Before we do that, let's remember exactly what we're talking about. Previously, we've talked about how the nervous system is subdivided into these groupings, and the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system includes the nerves, all of the different kinds of nerves. There's cranial nerves that come off the brain, there's spinal nerves that come off the spinal cord. And so any nervous tissue outside of the central nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. So it's mostly nerves. And what we're going to learn about today, the ganglia. I'll explain that later. So the peripheral nervous system is subdivided into two primary divisions, the sensory division that's bringing information in and the motor division that's bringing information out. So this is like intel coming in from our sensory organs, and this is command information going out to the parts of our body that can respond. Those are called effectors or sometimes target organs. So the motor division is commanding our body parts to do things, and that's divided into the somatic division and the autonomic division. Somatic is the skeletal muscles. Okay, that's all voluntary. Autonomic is all the stuff that we don't control with conscious thought. That's cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and any gland activity, endocrine or exocrine. So whether it's a hormone gland or not, it is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So that's kind of where we're focusing. So think autonomic is automatic. And then finally, because the autonomic nervous system is able to speed up or slow down various activities of our effectors, we subdivide it into two final divisions. In general, the sympathetic division is when we speed up responses, and in general, parasympathetic is when we slow down responses. So this is, I asked you to remember the S for times of stress and the P to return to peace. So we're going to dive into this a little bit more today. The autonomic nervous system controls all of the involuntary actions. We just mentioned that. That's going to include smooth muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, and all glands. Okay, and we will call those effector organs, or sometimes target organs. Same idea, like where is the message going? There's two divisions within the autonomic nervous system. We know this already, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And these two divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, they innervate the same visceral organs, the same organs in the ventral body cavity, but they generally have opposite effects. And so we're constantly speeding up and slowing down different things to maintain our homeostasis. All right, in general, the sympathetic nervous system is associated with fight or flight responses. We learned that in our divisions lecture. Fight or flight response, preparing you to either fight or run away from a life-threatening situation. However, we have those kinds of responses even when it's not a life-threatening situation. So basically what the sympathetic division does is it reduces non-essential activities. Okay, we are not worried about digesting our hamburger if we're running away from a bear. So we're going to divert blood supply from the digestive organs and send it up to the skeletal muscles so that we could run away quickly or potentially fight that bear. And in general, the sympathetic nervous system is known as the E division. That's kind of a weird way to say this, but it's responsible for many activities that start with E. So what are those activities? Emergency. If you're in an emergency, your sympathetic nervous system is going to help your body cope with that. If you have excitement, also starts with E. If you have embarrassment, or if you are exercising, all of the increased activities in certain areas and reduction in non-essentials will happen as a result of messages that are coming into those effector organs from the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so everything here starts with an E. So the E division. Now, we expect parasympathetic to be exactly the opposite, and it is. So it is associated with the resting and digesting response. And remember, resting and digesting does not mean resting sleeping. What we're talking about is just having a meal, sitting back on the couch, watching some TV, reading a magazine, whatever. So resting and digesting, and this is the D division. So what I mean by that is the normal activities that occur when the parasympathetic division is in charge. All right, so one of those is digesting. We don't digest well if we're under stress in the sympathetic division activity. So digesting, another one, defecation, going poop, and the last D, diuresis, which is urinating. So that's a nice idea. You have to be relaxed in order to poop. You have to be relaxed in order to pee and to digest. Okay, so that's the D division. So basic idea so far is that these two divisions will go to the same organs. They will talk to the same organs, but they will have opposite effects on them. This is what we need to respond to our E situations, and this is what we need to be able to accomplish our D situations. All right, because the target organs are innervated by both divisions, this is known as dual innervation. So we literally have two sorts of groupings of nerves that are going to these parts to help control this. Dual innervation. The two systems counterbalance one another to keep our bodies running smoothly. All right. Now for picture. A picture's worth 1,000 words, and this is no exception. So we're going to add lots of labels and stuff to this picture. It says in the title, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are a two-neuron system. What in the world? Well, let's talk about something that's a little bit easier to understand first, and that's the somatic division. So there's a couple labels that we need before we get started. First of all, this you can see in this first section, this area of our picture is representing the central nervous system, this section here. So I'm going to write that in this little box. This is the CNS, the central nervous system. And we'll always find our cell bodies and our dendrites hanging out in the central nervous system, at least to begin with. And then this section of our diagram represents what we would find in the peripheral nervous system. So we're just using this picture to organize. And this first picture here, see how it's separated from the next one? This is representing the somatic division. That was all the voluntary stuff. And this was the division of the nervous system that controls our skeletal muscles. So you can see this neuron stretches through the peripheral nervous system. This would be the brain and spinal cord area, peripheral nervous system, to reach out and talk to, these are our skeletal muscles. So this is the effector organs over here. Somatic nervous system talks to our skeletal muscles. All right, so we just have one neuron that reaches from the brain and spinal cord, from the central nervous system, through the rest of our body to talk to our skeletal muscles. And that neuron is releasing a neurotransmitter that stimulates the skeletal muscles and causes them to contract. So this plus represents that it's always a stimulatory effect. What does that mean, stimulatory? That just means it's going to stimulate a skeletal muscle. It's always going to have a stimulating effect as opposed to a sort of a depressive effect or an inhibitory effect, preventing something from happening. This is always going to cause something to happen. Okay, so one more time, the somatic division of the nervous system, this part right here that controls our skeletal muscles, uses a single neuron that stretches from the brain and spinal cord through the body part, all through the rest of the body, all the way over to the skeletal muscle and causes them to contract. But if we move down, I'm going to actually start at the bottom of the picture. Look, there's two neurons in this pathway. And this one has two neurons as well. And then this one has one neuron and some weird blob with a blood vessel. So there's more to the story in the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. It's not just one neuron that sends the message to the effector or target organ. We've got a coupling happening here, a two-neuron system. So this yellow area here represents the autonomic nervous system. I'm going to go ahead and label that. Okay, so all of these pictures represent something happening within that automatic or autonomic nervous system. The bottom one is the parasympathetic, and then this one that's in the greenish color is the sympathetic division. Sympathetic division, sympathetic nervous system, same. So let's start at the bottom with the parasympathetic division because it's easier. So again, the cell body and the dendrites are going to be located in the central nervous system, the brain or the spinal cord. Then we're going to have one neuron that stretches out through the body, makes contact with a second neuron. There's a little synapse here where the two of these communicate, and then the second neuron is the one that's actually going to send the messages to these effector organs. So notice, even though we're divided, here's a line dividing us, the effector organs are all the same. That goes back to the idea that there's a dual innervation. We have multiple ways to communicate with these organs here. So what are we looking at over here for our target organs? Well, obviously the heart is cardiac muscle tissue, right? These little chewed gum pieces are trying to be glands. And then this digestive system is representing our smooth muscle tissue, which we know can be in a lot of places besides the digestive system, right? Urinary bladder, uterus, blood vessels, airways, all sorts of places. Okay, but these effector organs are communicated with by these two neuron systems in the nerves of the autonomic division. And notice that we have a plus and a minus here. I'll get to that later. Okay, back to our parasympathetics. So we have a first neuron and a second neuron. And the way that we refer to these is by calling them pre and post, but it refers to this little area in orange. And this area in orange is an important concept, and this is going to be a new concept. I'm going to outline this little area in orange. And this area here where the first neuron and the second neuron are making contact and communicating with one another is representing a structure called a ganglion. A ganglion. And what is a ganglion? So let's put our definition down here. What is a ganglion? It comes from the root word gangly, which means a swelling or a knot. So this is actually, it's like a little bump on a nerve where there's a communication zone. And so I'm going to write down that technically a ganglion is a collection of neuron cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. Look, we're in the heading of being out in the peripheral nervous system. Normally, we consider the peripheral nervous system just the axon parts that are bundled into nerves. But we do have these little communication zones called ganglia, that's plural, and they're located outside the central nervous system. So what's the big deal about those? So here's the big deal. The ganglion is where the two neurons will be able to communicate with one another. They form a synapse or a communication zone, and they use chemicals to communicate to one another called neurotransmitters. And this is where the communication zone is between these two neurons that make up this two neuron system. This is not always the story, remember. If it's a nerve, a neuron going to a skeletal muscle, it's a single neuron stretching that whole way. But if it's one of these targets, we have to use a two neuron system. This just gives us like way more control over what's happening. So back to the neuron before the ganglion and the neuron after the ganglion. Now we can go ahead and assign each one of those a pre-status or a post-status. So the first neuron, the one that starts in the central nervous system and then stretches to the ganglion, becomes the pre-ganglionic neuron. And I remember learning this for the first time and just being really overwhelmed by that. But we know pre means before, and the ganglion is where the junction is. So this is just the neuron that comes before the junction. And then this other neuron is the neuron that comes after or post ganglionic. So this is the post-ganglionic neuron here. Okay, and that will stretch out to the effector organs and communicate with them using a neurotransmitter. All right, so we have two neuron system here. Okay, so let's look at a ganglion so you can get a better visual on this. I'm going to use the anatomy app, and I have got the creepy nervous system highlighted here, and that's it. So we've got our brain and our spinal cord and all of these nerves, and we can see them in big groups. This big clump right here in the sort of between the neck and the arm is called the brachial plexus of nerves, and then we've got the lumbosacral plexus here. That's not our concern right now. Right now we're going to look at some ganglion, and there is a long chain, I've highlighted them in blue, of ganglion right on either side of this spinal cord in the middle. So spinal cord's in the middle, look there's the lump. That's a ganglion. And then this is a little connector. So you can see these little lumps. I don't know if they're going to show them anywhere else. Probably not. I'd have to look within the actual organs. But this lump right here and right here, that's a ganglion. Here's another one. Here's another one. And they make this chain on either side of the spinal cord. And if you think about the nervous system as like our electrical wiring, it's just a place where we can allow two different wires to connect and communicate with one another. So it really just increases our interconnectivity within our nervous system. All right, so let's take a closer look at the parasympathetic division on the next page. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can get a better view here. Okay, so the parasympathetic division. We've got our brain and our spinal cord down here. These little squares and things are representing the vertebral column. We've got a couple of labels here. So remember, we're talking about having a two neuron system. The first neuron is the dark purple, okay, and it's drawn in a really simple way. This is another thing that confused me when I was learning about this a long time ago. They draw this neuron in a really simple way. So when you see that little circle, that's the cell body. The long part is the axon, and then when it splits at the end, those are the axon terminals. So our message always would go this way, right? So we've got a pre-ganglionic neuron, and look at that little tiny post-ganglionic neuron. And it's telling you what the effector organ is, or the target organ is over here. All right, so let's put some notes in these empty boxes. First thing I wrote, pre-ganglionic neurons originate in the cranial and sacral regions. What does that mean? Let's take an overall view of this page. Let's just zoom out. Notice there's nothing happening with the spinal cord the entire length of it. But way up here at the brainstem, that's where our pre-ganglionic neurons are branching off. And then way down here by the sacrum, nothing else is happening for parasympathetic division in this section. Perhaps you can guess that's where the sympathetic division is going to branch off, along in here somewhere. Okay, so these preganglionic neurons have what's called a craniosacral origin. It's either they're branching off the brain, that's the cranial portion, or the sacral area of the nervous system. So I'm going to put a little summary down here. Craniosacral origin of the preganglionic neurons. Okay, point number 2. This one's pointing at the preganglionic neurons, and I want you to look how long they are compared to these little baby postganglionics. So that is a feature. The preganglionic neurons are incredibly long, and they reach almost all the way out to the target organ, which means the ganglia, remember that's the area where the two neurons are going to communicate, is located either very close to or within the target organ. So you would actually be able to find those little lumps, for example, in the walls of the stomach or in the walls of the bladder, or at least super close by. So that is a feature of the parasympathetic nervous system is that the preganglionic neurons are really long. Preganglionic neurons are long and they reach the target organs. Let's also make sure that we have labeled these guys over here as our target organs, also known as effectors, because these can do something with the message they get from the nervous system. So very long preganglionics. And here you might have to add this to your picture if you're on a notes page, because these don't show up as great. But these lighter purples, those are the postganglionic. So we'll say that those are short. And then lastly, I'm actually going to add to the picture here, the ganglion would be where the communication is. So I'm circling the communication zone or the synapse between the pre-ganglionic neuron and the post-ganglionic neuron. Okay, and this is the ganglia, way out here. This is their communication zone. All right, so these ganglia are way out by the target organs. And so for our summary, I'm going to say the ganglia are very near or inside of the target organs. And because they're so far away from the spinal cord, we call them terminal ganglia. They're way at the end of this 2-neuron chain. So terminal ganglia are a part of the parasympathetic nervous system. All right, so we already noted down at the bottom, just as a summary, that there's a craniosacral origin of the preganglionics. And the neuron length, it goes from long neurons synapsing with short neurons. Okay, and the long represents the preganglionic and the short the post. And then finally, they're called terminal ganglia, located very close to the target organ. There's our summary for the parasympathetic nervous system. So, for example, we are trying to return to a peaceful situation after a fight or flight experience. This parasympathetic is going to cause the pupil of the eye to constrict because our pupils dilate in fight or flight. It's going to help the heart rate slow down. It's going to send more blood supply back to the stomach so we can digest. So let's come back to our first page and figure out what's going on with the sympathetics now that we know what happened with the parasympathetics here. We've got a similar situation with the sympathetics, but a lot of things are opposite. So we still have the 2-neuron system, of course. We still call it a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron. So terminology is exactly the same. This little orange area here is still a ganglion. No change there. But the main difference is going to be the length of the preganglionic and postganglionics and where the ganglia are located. So remember, for our parasympathetics, these were very long and these were incredibly short. And the ganglia, because they were so close to these target organs, were called terminal ganglia. This is exactly the opposite. The preganglionics are in general very short and the post are long. And so we have a different orientation for our ganglia. Let's go back to our anatomy app, because this long chain of the ganglia that I showed you before, this is called the sympathetic trunk. And this is how the sympathetic nervous system sends out its messages. It uses these two like strands of ganglia to make its synapses for its neurons to communicate. And you can see there's a lot going on. There's all sorts of branches going into the ganglia and coming out of the ganglia. So it gets very complicated very quickly. But basically, we're going to call these, instead of calling them terminal ganglia like we did, these are called either paravertebral, which means on either side of the vertebral column, or the sympathetic trunk. So you can use either of those. They're both appropriate. All right, so we're going to save this one for last. Let's go over to our notes for the sympathetics and see what is different. All right, so I've already mentioned that the preganglionics are short and the postganglionics are long. So I'm going to add those two in. All right, so that's opposite of what we saw with the parasympathetics. The ganglia, as I just showed you, this is trying to represent the ganglia here, that little like blue chain of ganglia. That's what they're trying to represent. Remember, those are really close to the spinal cord, which makes sense because if your pre-ganglionics are short, then your ganglia have to be close by. And we call that, remember, this chain of ganglia is called the sympathetic trunk or the paravertebral ganglia. Okay, so that's this row of circles right here. That's the sympathetic trunk or the paravertebral ganglia. And let's zoom out so we can get a bigger picture here. Notice where all the preganglionics are branching off of. In our parasympathetic division, we saw a craniosacral origin of those neurons. In our sympathetic division, it is all from T1 and a little bit into that lumbar region. So this is called a thoracolumbar origin. These preganglionic neurons always are going to originate from either the thoracic or the upper lumbar spinal cord. So we call that a thoracolumbar origin. Okay, so some of the highlights, just so you can have a really quick reference. We have a thoracolumbar origin for the preganglionics. This time we're going from short to long neurons in terms of their length. And because the preganglionics are short, our ganglia are close to the spinal cord. Again, you'll notice the list is almost identical to our previous list of target organs. In fact, if I display both pages together, you'll notice eye is the same, salivary glands, heart, lungs, stomach, pancreas, liver, gallbladder, genitals. There are a couple of differences though. So the skin is only innervated by the sympathetics, and that's the sweat glands and the erector pili muscle. And then we also have innervation of the adrenal glands. Let's take a look at that real quick because that'll help us finish up our front page as well. So if I zoom in on that adrenal gland and we look at the color difference, our preganglionics are dark green and our post are light green. Notice there's no postganglionic for the adrenal gland. So it's just a preganglionic that goes to the adrenal gland, and then we have action at the adrenal gland itself. That is another unique feature of the sympathetic nervous system, and it's represented here by this little sort of schematic. So we have, again, a preganglionic neuron, and we're sort of assuming that the adrenal gland is going to act like the postganglionic. It's a totally weird situation. It's only applicable to this nervous system, the sympathetic, but let's go ahead and label our adrenal gland. And so what happens here is the preganglionic sends the message to the adrenal gland, releases neurotransmitters, that's these little triangles here, and the adrenal gland releases its neurotransmitter, usually epinephrine or norepinephrine, adrenaline, directly into the bloodstream. So that's what these little dots are, the blue circles. So I made a note there that the epinephrine or norepinephrine, it kind of depends on the situation, are released directly into the bloodstream from the adrenal gland. So it's sort of acting like a postganglionic neuron, even though it's totally not. Okay, lastly, we got to tackle this idea that this is plus and minus over here. So remember, before we were talking about just skeletal muscles are always stimulated by the neurotransmitter. So it's always a stimulatory effect. The situation gets complicated even more in the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions because it matters what neurotransmitter is used. It also matters what type of receptor the target organ has. So we have quite a lot of specificity happening within this autonomic nervous system. I'm going to write a summary over here that describes this idea. Okay, so I wrote stimulatory or inhibitory. Those are opposites. So it either causes a stimulation of an event or prevent something from happening. And it depends entirely on the type of neurotransmitter. That's these little chemicals released at the end of the neuron. And it also depends on the type of receptor found on the target organ. So we are able to make a significant amount of very specific changes based on the way that this works. So there you have it, the basics of the autonomic nervous system.